for someone who's never heard of a charter school before, with your expertise, can you just explain what it is in layman's terms?
A charter school, let's start with the name. A charter school is a charter between a school and the authorizing agent, which would be usually a school district. Could be a county, could be a state, but primarily it's a school district. Charter schools are their own jurisdiction. They're their own local education agency, which is an LEA. So they function autonomously. So that's part of the conundrum of charters, is that they receive public money, but they're privately operated, and sometimes there's private ownership of the property or private management. So in that way, we think about them in the international space as public-private partnerships. Charter schools are the name here for that relationship between the public and the private. So a lot of times schools want to claim the public just because they receive the public money, but that doesn't really tell the whole picture. And that's part of the area that you can have issues, is where you have private entities having a lot of influence over the expenditure of public dollars. Charter schools were originally envisioned as a way to supplement public education. So to figure out new pedagogical strategies. They were supported originally by Al Shanker, who was the head of the teachers union in the 90s, the National Teachers Union, American Federation for Teachers. And so they were originally this pilot project of how do we figure stuff out before we roll it out to scale. But then they've gradually become more of an issue of supplanting public schools, where you have very high percentages. Obviously, the highest percentage in the United States is New Orleans, right? New Orleans, after Katrina, was virtually taken over entirely by charter schools. And that's where my research started about a decade ago in 2012. And of course, the charter school system had been there since '06. So there was a massive displacement of teachers, a total change in the operation of schools in forms of charter. And really underlying all of that is the basis of the charter system is a market or competitive basis. The theory is that charter schools will compete against each other and the public schools, and that competition will produce better results for students and families. Some of the issues with that are, I mean, in theory it works, in practice maybe not, is that you have situations where, because of that competitive pressure, many schools, charters, public schools, all are trying to do better on tests. So they end up selecting the students that are going to be performing the best on those tests, and the ones that are the cheapest to educate. So you take, for example, the issue of special education children. Those that have IEPs, individualized education plans, they cost more to educate and are more likely to perform at a lower level on achievement tests. So that means that schools would benefit, charter schools and public schools would benefit from a competitive perspective if special education students and other students that are low performing are not on their enrollment rolls. So you see this whole dance of how enrollment plays out in terms of selection before students get to schools, then students being forced out of school or counseled out of school. So these are a lot of the critiques of this system. Charter schools are a major feature of the competitive system, but then it goes all the way back to No Child Left Behind and high stakes testing in general, where everybody's trying to get a better test score to prove that their school should be funded. So,
interesting.
Yes, you have to peel the onion back.
Okay. I guess like my follow-up question is, would you say, because I think when people hear charter schools, they know it's a controversial topic. Would you say it's that how you described it, like private entity versus public funds, is why it's controversial? Or is it because it's kind of these two entities competing against each other? Or is it both of them that makes it so controversial?
I mean, I think it functions at a lot of levels. The controversy can exist at the philosophical level of, do you want your public sector to function like a market, or are public sectors going to be different, where we don't want to have winners and losers, but we want to make sure that everyone is educated. And that includes students that are the most difficult, the most expensive, the hardest to educate. They have to land somewhere. So where are they going to land in a competitive system versus a public sector which considers everybody, hopefully? And to be fair, That has not been the case in the United States over time. The public sector itself, we have had massive levels of segregation. I mean, we had segregated schools. We have schools that are resegregating along property and housing lines. We have disenfranchisement of multiple types of students, low socioeconomic students, students, BIPOC students. So that is sort of the crux of the argument is, can we do it better with a different way? And right now, the results are not showing that the better way is really doing better, right? It's the charter school way is really not even charter schools. The competitive market approach isn't producing wins for everyone. Okay. We would see our international test scores going up over the last 20 years. We would see the achievement gap disappearing. We would see all these problems that we are trying to address in the education system disappear. But in fact, we haven't seen them, and we've seen them exacerbated.
Interesting. And so let's talk about, how does California provide oversight of charter schools?
The short answer to that question is California is the wrong entity to think about oversight. California has laws, the federal government has laws, but the jurisdiction with the charter school is responsible for the oversight. So that falls to the district level. So if you have a charter school that's in Sacramento, a charter school that's in Natomas, you're going to have those districts are going to be responsible for the oversight. Now, one curious issue with charter schools is that oversight isn't necessarily about the district that the school is actually located in. So, for instance, you have schools operating in Oakland that are operated or that have a charter with the El Dorado district through the special education provision for those particular schools, right? So that makes it tricky. This is one of the issues of the market-based approach is, well, if you're, say, in Oakland, how do you account for students that are being governed not even by your own school board, but by a school board that's 100 and 150 miles away, right? So that gets a little tricky with governance and management and who's responsible for what, where the funds go, are the funds coming back to the community? So these are, again, the kinds of questions that come up in the system.
So in your opinion and from your expertise, what's the best way for a school to provide oversight, or how do they provide oversight? Is that, unfair to say they might not be if they're not even going there and seeing what's going on?
Well, so I'm a researcher, so I like to look at two things in particular. One, I want to know what the data show me. So are the data of students that are in these schools comparable to the data from the students in the surrounding areas? Or is there some kind of exclusion that I can derive from the data? Are the budgets similar? Do they reflect an appropriate expenditure of money in the classroom? Or is money being diverted away from the classroom? You could be a for-profit, but in California you can't have for-profit, but it can be, in that case, pushed towards higher administrative or senior level salaries, travel, bonuses, things that I know that your research has already uncovered a little bit. So, but back to that, then once I see that there might be anomalies, or just to find out more information, I would need to go do site visits and talk to folks and see what's actually happening on the ground. And I want to talk to the people that are actually doing the job, the management, and I want to talk to the people that they're managing, the students, the families, and figure out, are they being served well by their system, by that school, or is the school taking shortcuts and presenting on paper that it's working well to an entity that's 500 miles away and that's never on the ground, while in reality the students are being pushed into classrooms where they're being taught by teachers that don't have credentials or on emergency certifications, and or being taught by technology where they have a one-to-one device and they're not actually getting the kind of instruction, the deep instruction that we know is important for students to get on a interpersonal level with a teacher.
Gotcha. So you're saying that's what you would do as a researcher. Is that what school districts should also do?
Yes, we should be looking into how we're spending our public money. That's what accountability is for tax dollars. This is a massive enterprise financially. The education sector and the health sector are two of the largest sectors of the public economy. So we absolutely should know much better what we're doing with our money. And this, again, tracks further back, right? The entire theory behind the whole enterprise of the market-based system, one of the theories is deregulation, right? So when you deregulate, you're basically allowing organizations to function with less regulation, which has an advantage in terms of it can spur innovation, but at the same time, you may not know what's going on in those situations. So that's the case here where if you really truly have 0 visits on site by an organization that is mandated with oversight, that literally is not oversight. There's no sight involved in that.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I think in the case of California, you could have a situation where California is doing more oversight of the entities that are supposed to be doing oversight. And really, some of the things, and I would need to look into it further, but oftentimes I find that it becomes a very closed ecosystem where the people doing the oversight get hired into, say, the charter office at the state level, and they're the ones responsible for the funding and the oversight of the district level and then the charter schools, and it becomes very insular. So in that way, you may not have the level of regulation that's ensuring that student exclusion is not happening in the way that we want to make sure that it's not happening. And some of the findings from the research show that it is.
So you're saying that would be something that could help create more oversight that's needed in this system.
Policy is a double-edged sword, right? Policy has always unintended consequences. It's impossible to anticipate the consequences of policy. We sit around and we try to think about what happens when you enshrine this and make everybody do it. So I want to be wary about saying that, yes, we should have an entire policy around the oversight of the overseers. At the same time, we do know that there is a lot of free play that's going on, that we need more accountability for our public dollar. And so in that case, I would say I would like to have at least a conversation at a policy level on how we can ensure that the public dollars are going to the places they are intended to, in the case of education, to the students.
So there needs to be more.
There needs to be a policy
conversation.
conversation.
We need to be careful about
and we
it.
need to be careful about policy, right? But there needs to be a conversation. Where you see issues arising, it's an indication that you have a policy problem. And then we need to think about how do we solve this policy problem. And that's a process. It's not just let's just enshrine the legislation. But if the conversation is not happening in the way it should be, and it's not, then we need to have a different conversation. And part of the issue when it comes to charter schools is, and I know that you were going to ask about this later, but is the issue of lobbying. So there is a lot of money and interest in the public relations behind charter schools as a movement that comes from different sources. Politics makes interesting bedfellows, and this is the case of that too. But you have different international corporations, technology companies that stand to make a lot of money when school districts or charter schools with less oversight adopt their technologies wholesale, which we see in the case of Highlands. When I looked at the Highlands budget, I looked at their LCAP, the Local Control Accountability Plan, and I saw a $3 million line item for technology, one-to-one devices, which that can be a very positive development for the student if it's, again, not going to supplant instruction from a bona fide certified non-emergency credential or emergency credential, but really seriously on their way and not just taking a 2-year stopover, because we know that teachers need 3 to 5 years in the classroom to get good, and most American teachers are gone by that point, right? And matter of fact, that's an underlying feature of charter schools, is that a lot of the cost saving comes from having cheaper teachers who, by the way, don't have a union and are not protected by labor. So that is a whole other, I don't even know if it's a side issue. That's another major issue in why you see the different interest groups lobbying for this particular type of school. And it plays out in terms of who actually gets to be in the classroom and where does the funding go.
Since charter schools are exempt from many oversight requirements in traditional public schools, if any at all, what types of abuses are they most susceptible to? I think that kind of goes in line with what you were just saying too, is like, do you see these underlying themes?
Some of the regulatory issues that I would see with charter schools can fall into at least two bins: the student side and the management side. I've already spoken to the student side, where you can see a student exclusion and student selection happening. On the management side, we have a ban on for-profit charter schools in California, but nonprofit is really a status, then it means nobody makes money. Nonprofit charter school, you can funnel monies in different ways, most notably to management salaries, to different types of expenditures, trips, bonuses that benefit the private individual instead of the public sector, and namely the student. Where you're seeing, when I look at a budget, I'm looking to see, are those monies going to the classroom and will they end up benefiting the student, or are they benefiting the management side? And if they're benefiting the management side at too high of a ratio, then you can see there's an issue. Again, this goes back to the difference between a public and a private sector, right? The private sector spends money all the time on wining and dining and going to conferences that are very expensive and lavish. And I don't think we should be doing that necessarily with our public sector. But you see when organizations operate like a private sector that they take on those ways of doing business. And that is one way that you can redirect money without it being called profit. But I would say the primary way is through salary. The first thing I do is look at the salaries of the senior management, and usually they are far out of line. The senior management salaries at charter schools, in particular, not mom and pop's charter schools, but charter management organizations, where you have organizations running multiple charter schools, that's where I see very high salaries out of line with what we are paying educators across the state and the country.
Would you say $350,000 in pay and benefits for a year would be among those lines of a high salary for
That
a
seems
leader?
like a high salary in education. My salary is public, and I'm a professor at Sac State, and I don't make anywhere close to that. So it's a very high salary,
Yeah.
right? Absolutely.
Yeah. When you see the salaries going there, but you don't see, you said, student outcomes, how do you measure student outcomes? Is that graduation rates? What exactly is that?
I want to start with the big picture. When I look at an institution, any institution, are they fulfilling their mission? That's my measure of success. In the case of Highlands, their mission is to get older students into high school education with a career and technical vocation specific orientation to it. And so then I want to ask, on a 2 and a 5 year scale, looking past graduation, are these students actually in these jobs that they were supposedly prepared for? And then I want to go back and say, are they graduating with the necessary skills to get these jobs, and are they then going into them and holding them? And then I want to look at the achievement during the process. Are the students showing that they are gaining the necessary skills to get the certification, the diploma that will then lead them to that? And also I want to be very clear here. I don't only focus on student achievement via test scores. You're talking about a student population that has already been failed by the education system. So what is their socio-emotional status? How are we thinking about them as people? How are we treating them as individuals that all, in some way or another, need extra support? In particular, you have a student population here, which I think is 70% female, almost like 90%, above 90% low socioeconomic status. You have many of them that are mothers, and you have many of them that are going to work and trying to get a degree at the same time that they haven't gotten a degree during the entire 16, 18 years that they were allegedly given that time in our society to do that. That seems like a lot of challenges that we're facing. So how are we putting our money where our mouths are to the question of what they actually need to be successful, right? And then I would back up and say, and it's an interesting question about what niche this charter school is filling. Why do we have a charter school that is functioning out of Twin Rivers, operating in 50 different districts, did you say? What are those districts doing about their above age adult learners that need these skills to get better jobs, as is outlined in the LCAP for Highlands? So I would ask a question of our California system, what can the state do? Well, what is the state doing for these adult learners that have a clear need and a niche in our system, and we need them to be able to have higher earning capacity, and they're not getting the necessary skills and diplomas to do that. So I again, this is back to that root level question. Is this the best solution for our public sector need? Yeah. It seems like a bit of a stopgap to me.
You look at all these different aspects of the student and how they're actually doing.
If you're going to take a business approach to your school, any business is going to track how they perform over time. So why wouldn't you, if you're claiming or purporting to take a market-based, more business approach?
And one of the things you hit on is, the business. We've heard the executive director refer to it as a tech company, and then he'll switch to it's a public school, and then it kind of seems like in some areas they operate like it's a private school, and then we've heard it's referred to as, a business as well. Is that common with charter schools? Is that something you see as kind of this different outline of what exactly they are?
Yes. The rhetorical devices used in the charter school industry vary by audience. So when there is a desire to convince the public that charter schools are wholly public schools, you hear the term public charter schools. When you're trying to convince an audience of funders that your approach is very innovative, you will hear the term, we're a tech-based company, we're data-driven. Those types of terms are what plays in Silicon Valley. So you see the public relations dimension of charter schools and the movement, and really this is international in scope, is quite tailored and specific. I mean, you have the situation where a big supporter of charter schools, the Broad Foundation, wrote a manual for how people should speak at board meetings, and it was published in the New York Times. So the script is being written for public relations by people with a lot of money and a lot of interest in the success of this particular model.
Okay, perfect. Next question for you is, can general auditing techniques uncover fraud?
Again, I'm going to return to my researcher role, which is that I will look in particular at budgets, but unfortunately budgets are not granular enough to provide the level of data to make a determination of fraud. They are a very important first step, leading me to say, is there an anomaly or an overspend in a particular category relative to the other categories? Is there a non-specific entity? I have my most experiences with Oakland. I read an Oakland budget one time that had $20 million in a category called Other. I find that to be unacceptable use of public expenditures. So are there areas like that where there are questions where fraud could be happening, but we don't actually know? And then I would need to do more research to figure out, where is the money actually going? Who's benefiting from it? And for that, you really need a level of access to the actual budgets. And that requires oversight and really policy power to be leveraged. And in that case, that's so often not the case. So I think there is a certain level of information we can get from publicly available information. And then after that, to really make a case of fraud, we're going to need very, very detailed data to make that case. But if you're depending on whistleblowers the whole time, you're not going to find out nearly as much, and you're going to find it out too late.
With school districts, they have an authorizer fee. What are your thoughts on that, especially if the school district is in charge of oversight for the school they're profiting off of?
Any institution that is receiving money to oversee the institution it's responsible for overseeing from that institution is creating a situation that's ripe for a conflict of interest. And that goes for charter schools in this case. So the charter school is responsible for paying the district, which eventually pays the position of the person that's designed to say whether or not that charter school should exist. That can be a problem. Right? I mean, and not that it happens this way, but say somebody was responsible for saying something didn't work, and that would mean that they were out of a job. At what point would they actually say this doesn't work? Right? And so you get that kind of situation where school districts are in this, what I called a closed loop ecosystem, where you have the folks that have run charter schools move into the district, and they then oversee the charter schools, and they're going to have a natural proclivity towards continuing the model rather than pulling the plug if that were actually necessary. And maybe the gradients of change that are recommended aren't quite on the scale of what actually needs to change in terms of any budget malfeasance or something like that that's happening. So absolutely, it does create a conflict of interest.
Because it's an adult school, it's not necessarily like other schools within Twin Rivers competing for those students. It's only making the school district money. It's only, bringing in more students who wouldn't necessarily be in other public schools in under Twin Rivers district. It's not like they're going to go across the street to the K through 12 at Grant Union High School.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the unique thing with
Yes.
Highlands and Twin Rivers too. Do you feel like that plays a role in it as well?
Yes, I mean, Highlands is an unusual situation. It's a very niche area within education sector. So that undoubtedly plays a role in the incentive for Twin Rivers to host Highlands, because they're going to get more money in, and they're not actually going to be losing that money. It also, on a deeper level, begs a question of, if the theory behind charter schools is school choice and competition, where's the actual competition here? And so I don't know what the incentive is for a Highlands or any institution to improve when there's actually nobody else out there to do it. And that's the fundamental approach of the system.
Yeah, okay, so it's our understanding that charter schools' board of directors differ from school districts' boards. Charter boards do not have term limits and not elected. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So yes, it's true that charter school boards do not have the same type of board formation that our public schools have. We don't typically have an election for a charter school board, but we do for our publicly held offices like a school board. So that's an important difference of the role of democracy in the actual functioning of the school system.
And we've found that a lot of the board members are traveling on Highlands dime, or one we found the president went to a golf tournament, and they say it's for lobbying because it was the California's GUP, but they paid them $80,000 to, it appears, participate in this golf tournament.
It is concerning. It is concerning when you see public money spent on public education dollars spent so far away from the classroom. That is definitely a concern. And it raises a lot of questions about, what are they buying with that money? What kind of influence are they buying? What is the actual expenditure in terms of public dollars that is being redirected? And fundamentally, I think that is one of the major roots of the charter school system in general, is that education spending is, I don't know, $600-700 million a year in the United States, maybe more. Education spending globally is now estimated a little short of $7 trillion. So if you think that you were able to make about a 8 to 10% profit on that expenditure, and that expenditure is guaranteed every year because it's public money that's being spent, tax dollars, then you're talking about, $600 to $700 million a year at stake. And that draws the attention of a lot of people. And I'm not just making this up. I have sat at conferences with venture capital firms in Silicon Valley touting their approach and naming this dollar figure on the head of public education globally. I didn't make that figure up. Other people have made that figure up, and they are seeking to capitalize on it. And so the $80,000 for a golf tournament is just a micro example of this massive, very lucrative, in some perspectives, industry, which I call public sector, and other people would call an industry. And it really, when you break down that difference, how you approach how that money should be spent becomes very different. If you're spending money lobbying to get more influence in your industry, you might go to a golf tournament. If you're trying to improve education in your public sector, you might spend that on another teacher. $80,000 might get us a different teacher, or a couple of paras in a classroom to help a second grade teacher be able to do her job better. So that, for me, is an opportunity cost that we've lost over lobbying.